so we've talked a little bit about, we're going to segue into Sadie Mansfield as we talk about John Behan, because they are intertwined and not really in a great way sometimes. So Johnny Behan, he got here almost at the beginning of the territory. John Behan, at the tender age of 20 years old, he arrives in the Arizona Territory. He arrives in Yavapai County. He is a clerk for the first territorial legislature in 1874. So 20-year-old kid just got here. He's already getting himself involved in politics. He's working for the legislature. He's out trying to do mining on the side. And by January of '65, he's left Prescott. He's in the Verde Valley along the Verde River, and he is prospecting. He's with a group of other men prospecting. And he actually makes the paper in February of '66. So a year later, he makes the paper. Him and 5 other men are in the Verde Valley. They're prospecting. And one morning, while they're prospecting, they're attacked during breakfast by about 30-ish Native Americans. And these Native Americans have guns, and a shootout ensues. One Indian is killed. Several are injured. And luckily, none of the 5 prospectors, including Johnny, are injured. But it was big enough to make the paper at that time. Johnny gets a call out in the Arizona Miner about his bravery and his handling of the situation. So here he is, 20, 21, 22 years old. He is already making the news. He's a stand-up brave guy and worth his medal when things go bad. So he's making a name for himself. So he's already in politics. He's showing he's a brave man. Oops. And that's how, in about 6 months, 7 months after that incident with the Indians, he's back in Prescott, and he's appointed deputy sheriff in Yavapai County in Prescott. Sheriff Bork, remember Sheriff John P. Bork, his name comes up again real shortly here. He was the 3rd sheriff of the county, and he appoints Johnny Behan to be one of his deputies. So now we have Johnny. He's been working for the legislature, proving himself a stand-up guy. Now he's a deputy sheriff. 23 years old, and he's already solidifying who he's going to be for the rest of his life. And it takes off. By 1868, he's a deputy sheriff for 2 years, and in '68, he runs for county recorder, and he gets elected at the age of 23. He serves a term for that, and then he runs for county sheriff, and he gets elected. He's now the county sheriff. He does the sheriff for 1 term, and then he runs for legislature, and he gets elected. So while he was sheriff, and that's, you want to say, oh, what did he do while he was sheriff? And the truth of the matter is, he really didn't do anything when he was sheriff here. You can go through all 2 years of his term and search for all the newspapers, and they'll talk about him a lot. Johnny Behan was up in the hills prospecting. Johnny Behan was looking to make a deal over here. Johnny Behan bought this to sell that over here. He's making money left hand over fist, but he's really not doing a lot of lawman stuff. Now, true, he had deputies to do it, but back then, you only had a handful of deputies, and the sheriff was active. He was too busy trying to make money. So he really didn't do a lot of law work once he got the job. However, back when he's working, 69 puts him, he is the county recorder. In March of '69, when he's the county recorder, he marries 17-year-old Victoria Bork, who is the stepdaughter of his old boss, the sheriff. So obviously he knew her when he was a deputy. At that point, she was only 14. He waits till she's 16 and he marries her. Now, when he marries her, she's already 6 months pregnant. And that'll come up in the divorce papers. But she's 6 months pregnant. It's assumed it's his. They get married. She gives birth to a daughter and a son, Albert. Albert was born in 1872. He had, from a childhood illness, he had hearing problems. Plagued him his entire life. Johnny spent a lot of time taking him to specialist doctors in San Francisco and such, trying to help him out. Albert's actually buried here in Prescott. He, after the whole Tombstone incident, he came back to Prescott with living with his mom. He lived there most of his life. He's buried up at the Pioneer Cemetery, overlooking Walmart. And he was died in '49. He's actually, if you've ever been to Bingo's Kate's grave, he's like within 20 feet of her grave. So, another Prescott resident for most of his life. And you can see she was young, he was young. I mean, he was only 24, 25 years old. Very young man. However, this is essentially as good as it gets for Johnny. He is a beloved politician. Everybody speaks highly of him. He is married to a young woman. He has 2 little baby kids. His future looks bright. He's making money hand over fist. But this is where it all starts to fall apart. And it's that picture of him in about 1876, 77. So this is what he still had hair. And you'll see later photos he's bald, and it's probably because of everything that happens after this. So after the legislature, he reruns for sheriff. He goes, I'm going to be sheriff again. And in 74, he runs. And he goes all over Yavapai County. This man does like a Trump-like campaign. He's down in Black Canyon City. He's in Wickenburg. He's in the Verde. He goes everywhere. For 35 days, he is traveling Yavapai County by horse or wagon, campaigning. And he loses. Suddenly, this is his first election loss ever. He's been treasurer. He's been the sheriff already, and he loses his election bid. 2 years later, when the term ends, he runs again for sheriff, and he loses again. And this time he only lost by 78 votes, but he loses again. Twice in a row, Prescott said, we're done with you, Johnny. And part of the reason why he lost the second time, quite possibly, is the first time he lost, he comes back home, and his wife serves him with divorce papers. The divorce papers are interesting. Brad touched on this. So the divorce papers, and this is one of the handwritten testimonies from one of their friends, Mr. Charles Goldman, and he writes in there, and let's see if I can find it in here. Where's the laser on this?
Right above that.
There it is. Oops. There we go. There's the laser. He says that, let's see here. In the month of December 74, the exact time in the said month, I don't remember, I saw the aforementioned at a house of ill fame and prostitution. Let's see, situated on Granite Street, near Gurley Street, in the said town of Prescott. Let's see, at which resides one Sada Mansfield, commonly called Sada, a woman of prostitution and ill fame. And the said aforementioned did at the time, anyway, it goes on and on, you can read that. Bottom line, he's actually, Sada Mansfield is mentioned in his divorce papers as the reason for the divorce, because he's too busy seeing other women. Johnny had a woman problem his entire life. He cheated on his wife. He cheated on other men's wives. He cheated. He saw prostitutes. He had an issue, but Sada Mansfield was actually named in his divorce papers as the reason for the divorce. And like Brad said, Peter Brand has done an amazing job on his research that definitively says that Sada Mansfield was Josephine Sarah Marcus. Let's go back there. So he comes home. She files for divorce. She claimed that he was seeing Sada Mansfield. He never denied it. He never said he wasn't seeing her. But what he did deny was that Henrietta was his child. And that's the one that was she was 6 months pregnant when they got married. Suddenly he's saying, that's not my kid, I don't want to pay child support. And his child support was then, she was stricken from the child support, and he only paid $16.16 a month for Albert. So again, Johnny, women, and money. It becomes very common, a common theme in his entire life. So he's lost 2 election bids, he's divorced, his name isn't the best in town, he leaves Prescott. He goes to Mojave County. Actually, I take that back. He goes down to Tucson, and he's a sergeant at arms for the territorial legislature. Again, it's basically he's an appointed rules keeper and order keeper for the legislature. He does that for that term, which is January through about April, and then in later '77 he moves to Mojave County. He leaves. He bypasses Prescott. He just gets out of town, and he goes to Mojave County. He goes to Signal City, which doesn't really exist anymore. There's a couple ruins there. It's on the south end of Mojave County. It's actually really getting close to into La Paz at this point, because La Paz didn't exist at the time. But he opens up a hotel and a saloon called the Virginia House, and he advertises, and it's going pretty well. He owns it with another man. He runs for legislature for Mojave County, and he wins. But remember, Mojave County is a backwater. Mojave County is no man's land, even by Arizona Territory standards. The entire county is like 1,000 people, 1,100 people, and the town that he has his hotel in is about 400 people. I mean, there's nobody there. The entire county is almost vacant, and it's just people are there for the mining. So it's really, there's no future there, but he goes there to at least to make some money off of miners. So I just discovered this right here at the bottom. I have not been able to find anything else about it. But in May of '78, when he was running the Virginia House, Behan is arrested and charged with shooting another businessman. And I'm still trying to do the research on this, but I think it was a saloon owner in town. But he shoots him, and they ends up being taken down to Wickenburg for trial, and he's found not guilty. They acquit him of the charges. But I still haven't found out why he shot Mr. Brown, or exactly what came out of the whole thing. So I'm going to be looking into that. But again, even though Johnny has this reputation as being a do-nothing lawman, it doesn't mean that he's not a tough guy. It doesn't mean that he's not able to take care of himself and take care of business. It's just not his priority in any way, shape, or form. So once this acquittal is done and he's pretty much the Virginia House is played out, he does come back to Prescott. But he comes back to Prescott as the Mojave County Territorial Legislator. They elect him to be the legislator. So he comes over here to Prescott. He's living here on Mojave County's dime. And the territory, he's elected in '78. The legislature again goes from January to about April, kind of how it does nowadays still. And he's living in Prescott, running businesses in Prescott, but he's acting as a legislature for Mojave County. And like Brad said, the territorial capital moved back and forth a lot. It was Prescott, then it was Tucson, now it's back in Prescott again, and that's where Johnny is. And this is a pretty solid picture of Prescott in the late 1870s, possible early 1880s. Not bad. I mean, you can recognize it. The plaza is right here, but the courthouse did not exist at this time. It was just a vacant lot. The courthouse is actually where the Masonic Lodge building is nowadays on North Cortez Street. So this is Johnny Behan's final fall in Prescott. While he is the Honorable J. Behan, legislator for Mojave County in Prescott, he has an altercation that the papers talk about. They don't say what started the altercation, but he has an altercation with a Chinese laundromat in town. And the way it's worded, I'm assuming it's the Chinese laundromat in town. He gets into an altercation. It becomes physical. They pull out sticks and brooms and start beating him. He pulls his gun and it misfires, and he has to run away as he's being chased by Chinamen with sticks. And this is the time frame when Virgil's here. So this is Virgil's opinion. This is his introduction to John Behan. So if Virgil has a low opinion of Behan, it's probably because of the Chinese laundry incident, realistically. So once the legislature's over and he's out of a job again, he ends up going up to Tip Top. And we talked about Tip Top, Brad, and Gillette. Tip Top was the mining community. Gillette was the smelter community. It was another mini boom town. So Behan goes up to Tip Top, and he opens a saloon. Now, in the 1880 census for this saloon, they list him as the saloon owner. They also mention a Sadie Mansfield living there also, working as a courtesan, which is a fancy way of saying a prostitute. So Behan was seeing her on the side when he was married. She ended up in '76 leaving Prescott, and then she's back by 1880 working up in Tip Top. Now, you could say, well, the movies say, well, he was in love with her, they were going to get married, and whatever happened. I don't think he ever loved her, because I don't think you'd be whoring out your future wife, realistically, to be blunt. But that's what she was doing there. So it was founded in 76, and by 1880, it had a post office and 500 inhabitants. It was a decent sized little community in the Bradshaws. And for those of you who don't know, Tip Top is basically due west, more or less, of Black Canyon City, in the mountains there. It's on the backside of the Bradshaws coming down to Lake Pleasant. There's not much there anymore. So Behan's there. He's working as a saloon owner. He's making money. He has Sadie Mansfield working for him. There is a stage robbery in that area in '79 in December, and Behan does join the posse. Apparently, they never caught the guy, but he was part of that posse, and he's mentioned in the paper as being as such. So he still can be a stand-up guy when the need comes. So he's living in Tip Top. Sadie Mansfield's there with him. And they're there, it's late as June. In August, Behan tries one last time to make a name for himself in Prescott and stay in Prescott. He runs for county recorder. Again, not the most high-speed, low-drag elected position, but it's a county position. It's an important position. He runs for it. He doesn't even get the Democrat nomination at their convention in Prescott. So he can't even get the Democrats, which he's a Democrat in Arizona. He can't get his own party to even give him a nod to run. So he is done in Yavapai County. He sees the writing on the wall, and he decides he's leaving. He sells the Tip Top Saloon, and Sada leaves and goes back home to San Francisco, and he goes down to Prescott. And by September, so the August August of 1880 is when they're doing the politicking for the county offices. By September, the papers say he's arrived in Tombstone with his son. He has at this point he has custody of his son, who I think is about 10 years old at the time, 8 years old, and he comes down to Prescott. Down to Tombstone. So he has given up on Prescott completely. He's going to try to, like everybody else, he's going to try to reinvent himself. So, who did Johnny know when he was here in Prescott? That's the question. So, he probably knew Virgil, realistically. They were both here in '79. They were both in politics in '79. Behan was a legislator. Virgil was a constable. Like we said, there's only like 1,800 people. So, realistically, he probably, whether they knew each other friendly or just knew of each other, they would have known each other just by the virtue of the size and the fact they're both in politics. But Virgil's opinion, like I said, would be colored by the fact that he knows Behan as the guy who lost the last two elections as sheriff and got beat up by a bunch of China laundrymen. So that's his opinion. That's going to be that's his introduction to Behan, despite of what he may have done in his past. Sadie Mansfield, of course, he knew Sadie. She was mentioned in his divorce papers. He knows her real well. And then they were in Tip Top together. Did Johnny know Doc Holliday or Wyatt or Big Nose Kate? No, they weren't here when he was here. By the time they arrive in Prescott, he's up in Tip Top. And there's no way to say, in fact, whether he, if he would have crossed them or not, but it's not likely. So that's Johnny. Johnny starts big in Prescott, ends up washed up in Prescott, and goes down to reinvent himself. And that's a common theme we talk about, trying to make money, make your name, or reinvent yourself when you go to Tombstone. So this is probably the best book written on John Behan. It's called Sacrifice Sheriff. Stay. Bob Alexander wrote it. It's a great book. He's a bit of a Behan fanboy, I will admit. Behan can do no wrong and everybody else can do no right. But it's still a good read, and it's fairly accurate overall if you can get by his fanboyism. Virgil. We're going to talk about Virgil now. I have a deep-seated respect for Virgil because we both held the exact same office. So, the Earps get to Yavapai County in Prescott in 1877. Probably, according to Alley's writings that Waters converted over to his book, early July of 1877, the Earp train arrives in Arizona. They're coming out of Dodge through Las Vegas along the trail, the Beale Trail, till they get to Winslow, and then they head diagonal down what's called the Chavez Trail. You can see right here, this is now Winslow, basically. Here's a train, which is basically I-40. 87 kind of does this. So it kind of follows 87 and it goes out towards Stoneman Lake and then down to Camp Verde. And then it continues on to Prescott. So essentially it kind of follows 87 to Stoneman Lake and then down I-17, across the 169, and then up the 69 into Prescott. If you want to, it's basically the same trail, more or less. Virgil comes down here. He's in a train of wagons with his family. His brother Newton, his father Nicholas, and the families. They're all coming down. The family's actually going to San Bernardino, and they're just cutting through Prescott because that's where you stop. Because the rest of the railroad wasn't there. It wouldn't be there for another 5 years. So that was the only way to get there. So they're traveling along. Virgil and Allie actually stop in Camp Verde. They stop for a while, and the family continues on. And the papers of the time do mention Nicholas and Newton in Prescott with their wagons. And we'll talk about the sawmill when we get to that part. So Virgil gets to Camp Verde, and it's been reported for quite some time, going back to Waters' interviews with Allie in the 40s, and other historians, that he drove a mail wagon 2 days to Prescott and back. And some people would say, oh, it's Camp Verde. I'm sorry, it was Chino Valley. And then Chapa thought it was Miller Valley. But none of these are 2 days away from Prescott. I don't care how bad the roads are. It's not 2 days to get to Chino Valley, unless you're driving today and it's traffic. But nobody could really figure out where he was doing this. However, came across this. Santa Fe to Prescott mail line. It is a stage line. Mr. Baker, who Allie originally said they worked for Mr. Baker. And Mr. Baker had the mail contract. It was the capital to capital mail route from Prescott to Santa Fe, from territory to territory. And part of that route went from Prescott to Camp Verde. 2-day travel, twice a week. So we're pretty certain that Virgil drove the mail wagon for Mr. Baker from Camp Verde to Prescott. And you can see it was a whopping $7 to ride the wagon with him. And people going from Santa Fe to Prescott and back and forth, that was the only route to take. So he drove the wagon for several months. Well, many weeks to several months. We don't know exactly how long. What we do know is that by October of that year, Virgil is in Prescott. They have relocated. They are living in Prescott. Him and Allie are living in Prescott. We don't know where they lived. When they first get there, they may be renting a house from somebody. They may be squatting on land. The stories about the sawmill or the woodworking comes up later in 79. So in 77, we're not sure where they were living. They didn't own property. Virgil did not own property in Yavapai County until he came back in 1898. Or he came back in 95, but in 1898 he bought property. So we don't know where he lived, but again, Prescott's not that big. So his big, again, he's just a guy. Brad and I talked about this yet. The Earps, they get to Prescott, they're just guys. Doc Holliday, he's just a guy. Nobody knows who they are. But Virgil makes his first name for himself on October 16th of 77. And this is a 45-minute presentation on its own, so I'm going to really cut this down. Essentially, 2 Texas cowboys are in Prescott on October 16th of 77, and they run into another Prescott resident, and all 3 know each other. Well, the Prescott resident knows these 2 guys as murderers out of Texas. They killed the deputy sheriff out of Texas. So they threaten him to keep his mouth shut. They pull guns on him. They threaten him. Mr. McCall, who is the witness, runs out of the saloon, which is on Whiskey Row. It's where the Arts Prescott Gallery is now. It was Jackson and Tompkins. He runs across the plaza. He runs over to where the Masonic Lodge is nowadays, which was the courthouse then, and he swears out a murder warrant for these 2 guys. The judge, the justice of the peace, signs the murder warrant, gives it to the constable, Constable Frank Murray. Frank Murray comes back down to arrest these guys. He finds them out on Whiskey Row, on the boardwalk, shooting at a dog on the plaza. You know, and like Brad likes to point out, a dog on the plaza. Who would imagine that? But there was a dog in the plaza and they were shooting at it. So the marshal, or the constable, walks up and shows him the warrant and says, hey, I have a warrant for your arrest. Well, the bad guys don't take kindly to that. They put their guns on the constable, they mount up on their horses, and they ride southward out of town. Shooting, literally the paper says, shooting left and right and hooting and hollering as they ride out, like a bad B-Western. They charge out. And they leave town. So the constable runs and finds 3 people hanging out together in a saloon. He finds U.S. Marshal Wiley Standiford. He finds Yavapai County Sheriff Ed Bowers. And he finds Prescott citizen Virgil Earp. E-R-B is how the paper called him. Because he was so new that nobody knew how to spell his name or who he was. And Mr. Virgil Earp. So these 3 men, plus the witness, Mr. McCall, who got his guns pointed on him, and the constable, they all mount up and they ride out of town to find these guys. Well, these guys rode as far as essentially Carlton and Granite Creek, where the high school is, or where Malham Middle School is. That's how far they rode out of town. But it was out of town. So they, the posse rolls up on them. They dismount. They order them to surrender. These guys pull their guns. Shootout ensues. Virgil is called out in the newspaper for doing good work with his Winchester. They kill both guys, and Virgil is the hero of the newspapers for that event. Somehow the sheriff isn't the hero. The constable's not the hero. The U.S. Marshal's not the hero, but Virgil's the hero. So that's his introduction to Prescott and being somebody in Arizona. So while he's in Prescott, he ends up being a stage and freight driver for Patterson and Caldwell, and they run a stage line from Prescott up to Tip Top, where Johnny Behan will be eventually, once a week. He runs a stage line up there and back, and he's doing that for several months in '78. Then he becomes the night watchman, or he tries to become. We'll get there. He's the night watchman. He gets elected constable. We'll cover all this, and the firewood cutter. We'll cover all that in detail here. But that's what he did here while he was here for those 3 years: stage driving, night watchman, constable, and also a firewood cutter. So the Patterson and Caldwell stage line. Like I said, they went to Tip Top. Virgil is constantly being interviewed by the local papers. Whenever he does a stage he runs a route up to Tip Top and back. As soon as he gets it back in town, the reporter's there. Hey, Virgil, tell us what's going on up in the Bradshaws. And he's always being interviewed. And he's always saying, well, this mine's doing great, or they had a horse race over here, and so won $20. And he's the man on the street that they go to for everything. So he's becoming very popular, very well known. He actually ends up driving the acting governor, Gosper, and the editor for the Miner up to Tip Top one day to show them around, because they want to see what's going on at Tip Top. It's starting to boom. And I have to wonder if this stage ride with Gosper, the acting governor, had any bearing on Doc Holliday rooming with the acting governor in 2 years or in a year. It's a distinct possibility. And you start seeing all these relationships starting to web into each other. So, when Virgil quits Patterson and Caldwell, and Patterson and Caldwell goes defunct, and they flee to New Mexico, owing like a lot of money. I forget how much money they owed. A lot of money. Virgil ends up applying in March '78. He applies for night watchman, and they turn his application down and they appoint somebody else. And when that guy resigned, though, they do appoint Virgil. Reapplies and he gets appointed. Now the night watchman position, it's kind of like a cop. It's not really. His main job was to patrol the streets at night, make sure no burglaries happened, and make sure no fires happened. And if there was a fire, to ring the alarm. That was his primary job. However, the night watchmen were also sworn in as special deputy marshals for the town, so they did have arrest powers. And in October 5th, he did arrest somebody for shooting in the streets at night, which, again, never happens here anymore. And then that same issue, they talk about a shooting contest in Prescott. And these kind of things were very popular. Tombstone mentions them also. Shooting contests where they'd have competitions for money. And Virgil ties for first place, making 44 of 45 shots. So again, Virgil's being mentioned in every newspaper. He's the man on the street for all this. He is the night watchman. He was in his big shootout a year earlier, and now he's winning shooting competitions. So he has a reputation that's building around him at this point. So he's night watchman in September, and in November 1st, he puts an ad in the paper saying, "I'm running for constable." And they have an election. A few days, 4 days later, they have an election, and Virgil gets the most votes. Now, back then, you had 2 constables and 2 justices of the peace for every precinct. Now it's 1 and 1. But back then, it was 2 constables, 2 precincts, or per precinct. The 2 existing constables, the first one was Nathan Pard Pierce. Nathan Pierce was the original constable of Prescott. He had been constable at this point for like 13 years. Since 1865, he was a constable. The second one was Frank Murray, who was involved in the shootout with Virgil the previous year. So you have the constable who's been here forever, Murray, who's been doing a good job, who's also, by the way, the chief of police at this point, and Virgil Earp. And Virgil ends up getting more votes than any of them. One thing you end up learning about Virgil when you study him is that he was very gregarious, he was a big personality. And when he walked into a room, everybody knew he was there. So it was, so he got elected. Obviously, his personality paid into a lot of that. But so now him and Murray are the constables of Prescott. So it was a 2-year term. He gets through 1 year of it, from November to November, from November 78 to November 79. He gets through his first year, and this is where we get to the wood thing of 79. Everybody talks about him with a sawmill. He put in a bid. Fort Whipple was asked for bids to provide them with wood, and he puts in a bid for 500 cords of firewood. Never did hear if they accepted his bid or not, but he did put in a bid for 500 cords of firewood. It's important to note that he's bidding on cords of wood, not board feet of wood. If he had a sawmill and he was actually producing boards for construction, he'd be putting in a bid for board feet, but instead it's for cords of wood. I've done a deep dive into sawmills in Prescott from 1877 to 81. He doesn't show up anywhere as owning a sawmill. I think he just had acreage west of town that he was felling trees and selling the wood for firewood to make extra money. So he's constable. He's constable. He's also still chopping firewood and selling it. In June of 79, he does an asset seizure. He's ordered by the judge to go seize assets to satisfy a lawsuit. Mr. A sues Mr. B. Mr. A won. Mr. B is supposed to pay him money. Mr. B doesn't pay him money. So Virgil is ordered to go out there and seize assets and sell at an auction to get Mr. A his money. Well, apparently he oversteps his mandate. He ends up seizing a wagon with 300 pounds of corn on it. And there's some debate. It's really, the records aren't really clear. He either just overstepped his mandate of what he was trying to seize, or the wagon and corn didn't actually belong to Mr. B. But either way, he has to give back the wagon with the corn, and he gets fined $85 in court costs. So he screwed up. But it happens, I guess. Then finally, in October 3rd of 79, Virgil's in the paper again, not for a good thing again. Him and Mr. Hansen are west of town, chopping wood or doing whatever they're doing, and apparently they beat the living crud out of a Mr. Schultz. Mr. Schultz comes back from town, from the west end of town, battered and bloody about his face and head, saying that Mr. Earp and Mr. Hansen assaulted him with a gun and a stick. And if you're reading it in order, Virgil had a gun and was beating the crud out of him, and Mr. Hansen had a stick and was beating the crud out of him. And so he runs back. And they don't ever say why he was assaulted. However, the next week, the newspaper does report that Mr. Schultz is west of town prospecting. So I'm under the impression that Mr. Schultz was probably out prospecting, trespassed on Virgil's property. There was a dispute on the property line maybe, or who had the right to be there or not didn't right to be there. And Earp and Mr. Hansen solved it the old-fashioned way. Anyway, he's charged. He files charges against Earp and Hansen, and this is October. nothing happens until December. And Virgil and his brothers are all gone by that point. They've been gone for 2 weeks. And the newspaper just reports that the charges were dropped. So we don't know if it was dropped because he wasn't around anymore. We don't know if it was dropped for lack of evidence or if it was invalid, or we don't know why, but it was dropped. And it never goes anywhere. So Virgil's busy in 79. He's being sued, he's beating up people, he's chopping wood, and occasionally I guess he's doing constable work, but it never shows up in the paper. So, despite some of the issues that they had in Prescott, like being involved in a shootout and being sued and having to beat people off their property, Allie always said that Prescott was her most favorite place. It kind of proves that when they came back in 1895. But it was their favorite place, and she didn't want to leave. When they went to Tombstone, she did not want to leave. But like Brad said earlier, silver was discovered in 1877 in Tombstone. So Brad's already covered the rivalry and the growth of the towns. But by 79, in June of 79 or July of 79, the town's being built. Silver's found in 77. A year and a half later, the town is being built. They're building a town. And Tombstone's going to be the next big thing. Here's the thing. All the movies, all the books, all the stories always say it's Wyatt's idea to go to Tombstone. That's highly unlikely. Because if you look through all the Dodge City papers of the era, there's no mention of the word Tombstone. The town Tombstone never pops up. The only way Wyatt would have known about Tombstone is Virgil writing him and saying, hey, brother, there's the next big thing happening, and we need to be down here and be part of it and get rich. Because as Brad's already shown, Tombstone had been in the Prescott papers nonstop, and it was not in the Dodge City papers. So it was Virgil's idea to go to Tombstone. And this, by the way, this is a picture of Allen Street in April of 1880. This little white building right here, the white false front with the arch on it, this is the Golden Eagle Brewery that will become the Crystal Palace if you've ever been down there. This building under construction right here is the Oriental. So, as you can see, I mean, compared to Prescott, it was booming, it was growing, but it still wasn't much yet. But anyway, they get ready to leave for Tombstone. So Virgil writes his brother, Wyatt, and his common-law wife, and James, his older brother, and his common-law wife. They pack up and they leave Dodge City. They leave Dodge City, they go through Las Vegas, New Mexico. They end up picking up Doc Holliday and Big Nose Kate. And somewhere between October and November, that wagon train arrives in Prescott. So it arrives in Prescott, again, like Brad said, Doc Holliday and Wyatt Earp arriving in town doesn't even make the papers. They may have gone directly past town and camped out at Virgil's house west of town, if that's where he was staying, and it never made the papers. Could Wyatt have drank on Whiskey Row? It's possible. They would have definitely supplied up in Prescott downtown before they head out. So what does happen, though, is the November 14th minor does say that Virgil Earp is preparing to leave for Tombstone, and they advise against it. They say it doesn't sound like a good place, and we would not advise going there. But because again, like Brad was saying, they're trying to discourage people from leaving because they're having a big brain drain, for lack of a better word, of the movers and shakers leaving town. So hey, Virgil's leaving too, but we don't advise it. So Doc stays behind, as Brad said. Virgil, Wyatt, and James and their wives all leave for Tombstone, somewhere shortly after November 14th of 1879. Now, we said Doc and Big Nose Kate stay behind. Virgil turns in his constable badge to the county, and he is given a deputy U.S. Marshal commission for the Tombstone precinct of Pima County. There's a lot of lawlessness down there. Tombstone's a fast-growing area. They don't even have a deputy sheriff appointed down there yet in Pima County. There's stage robberies happening. There's all kinds of problems happening. Virgil's a stand-up guy. He's well known to the U.S. Marshal, so he appoints him as his representative in Tombstone. So Virgil leaves with a U.S. Marshal commission. They left with 3 wagons and extra horses. Like Brad mentioned, Their goal was to use those wagons and use those horses and run a livery company. They're going to run a freight company. That's what Virgil knows. That's what he's been doing off and on, is running stage lines and running freight lines. So they're going to run a freight line in Tombstone. Unfortunately, when they get there, they find out there's already 2 stage lines and freight lines, and they're in a bidding war. And they're at a race to the bottom to drive the other one out of business. So there's no way they can compete. So they sell their wagons, they sell their horses, and they just try to do what they can. Funny story, Allie, like I said, Allie did not want to leave. She was happy in Prescott. She liked Prescott. She was settling down. She liked it there. She didn't want to leave. They were leaving, and there was no room for her sewing machine. And she flat out said she will not leave without her sewing machine. So they had to make room for it, and they took it along. And it was a good thing, too, because she was when they first got there, she was the money maker for the family, sewing alterations and sewing rips and tears for all the miners and men down there. So the Earps, they said they were somewhere around November 14th. They're leaving. They arrived in Tombstone December 1st, 1879. We know that because of the Spicer hearing depositions after the OK Corral. That's when they arrived in town. This is a copy of Virgil's appointment as U.S. Marshal. What I find interesting is Yavapai ends up being crossed out, and they write Pima underneath it. I don't know if it was a mistake they made then or what, but that was actually signed on November 27th. So I think it actually happened when he got to Pima County. Somebody redid his commission for him. So, who could have Virgil have known? Like we said, we talked about Johnny Behan. He probably knew Johnny, realistically. We don't know how well he knew him, but he did know him. He didn't know Sadie Mansfield, most likely. But they're going to talk about Frank Stillwell in a second. He might have known Frank Stillwell. They both have a shooting a day apart from each other. And it's very possible, and I haven't found the records yet, I'm going through them right now, but it's basically a pile of microfiche, and you have to go through it, and they're not in order. But it's possible they had their coroner's inquest hearing on the exact same day for their shootings. So they may have been sitting in court next to each other. And of course, Frank Stillwell is the one who killed Morgan within 2 years. Virgil probably knew Doc Goodfellow. Brad talked about Doc Goodfellow a lot. They were both citizens of Prescott for 1.5 years during that period of time when they were both overlapping each other. Goodfellow was a well-known personality. Virgil was a politician. He was one of the few doctors in town. They probably knew each other. They probably did associate in the same circles. Virgil should have known Thomas Fitch, the lawyer. And that would explain, if Virgil knew Fitch, especially if he knew him well enough, that would explain why Fitch came down to Tombstone to represent them in the Spicer hearings and represent them in the OK Corral hearings. Because otherwise there's no reason for Fitch to come down unless he knew Virgil and maybe they were friends. This is still the definitive book on Virgil, Virgil Earp, Western Peace Officer by Don Chaput. I bought this book when it was new in '93. It's still the definitive book, even though new information has come out to clarify some things, and there's a few things that he got wrong as well, including the stage route for Camp Verde. But it's still the absolute best book out there. I highly recommend it. Finally, Mr. Frank Stillwell. Some of you may have seen another photo of Stillwell if you look at Wikipedia or some other ones, or him sitting in a chair with a big cigar. That's not him. This is him. There's a lot of photos that people think the Curly Bill photo. That's not Curly Bill. The Ringo photo. People still argue if that's Ringo or not. But this is Frank Stillwell. Very nice looking, nicely dressed man. Psychopathic killer. So, Stillwell, born in Iowa, possibly in '56, only because he gives us an age as 24 in the 1880 census. So they're kind of, we're just backdating and saying 56-ish. Grew up in Palmyra, Kansas. His parents divorced in '63. Mom gets the 2 daughters. Dad gets the 3 sons. Dad ends up going to Oklahoma Territory. That's Palmyra nowadays. I cannot find for the life of me an old photo of Palmyra, Kansas, but I don't think it looks much different probably. His brother is actually famous. His brother is actually a big person in history. Simpson Comanche Jack Stillwell. It's his older brother. He was an Army Scout. He was a U.S. Marshal. He was a judge, a U.S. District Judge in Oklahoma. He was a big man in Oklahoma. So, in 1877, Frank Stillwell and his brother Comanche Jack they come to Prescott. Not sure why they came to Prescott, but they come to Prescott. And again, this is about the time what it looked like. You had, the saloons over here. The courthouse plaza was just fenced off. They actually ran cattle in it. And hey, Craig, Supervisor Brown, could we run cattle on the courthouse plaza again? We can? Thank you. Among other things. Whiskey Rose over here. This is Gurley Street. But when they get here, it's a booming little town in 77. It's starting to pick up. Comanche Jack, for whatever reason, doesn't like it. And he goes back to Oklahoma. But Frank stays. Frank stays, and he gets picked up by a cattle outfit up in Miller Valley, back before Miller Valley had houses. And he's working as a ranch hand for George Young up in Miller Valley. And this is not anybody there, but it's a nice picture that kind of explain what they're doing. So he's working as a ranch hand, and he gets into trouble. So they're working the ranch up there, moving cows, and the chuck wagon, Mr. Young hires a new cook, is it Jose Vega? Yeah, Jose Vega. And Jose Vega is Jesus, not Jose. Jesus Vega. Jesus Vega is the cookie. He's the cookie for the chuck wagon, and he serves tea with one of the meals. And Stillwell starts berating him for serving tea and not coffee. And Mr. Vega says, "Hey, if I knew you wanted coffee, I would have made coffee, but I made tea because nobody said anything." And Stillwell continues to berate him and use racial slurs against him, to the point where Vega, depending on which article you read, either took a frying pan or took a shovel, which, they're the same size and shape and object, and comes at Stillwell and hits him with it. Stillwell pulls his gun, shoots and kills him. And this is going to be a day or so before Virgil shootout with those Texas Cowboys. So he shoots the cookie, he kills the cookie, and he ends up going into Prescott to answer for the charges. And they have a coroner's inquest, and they said, well, he killed the guy in self-defense because he was attacked with a frying pan or a shovel. I'm really, really curious, though, if this inquest was on the same day as Virgil's and they could have been sitting in the same courtroom together, because that would be ironic given the situation a few years later. And this is a copy of the newspaper article for the shooting affray, as it's called. So, after this whole incident with the cookie, Stillwell kind of drops out of sight. Oh, a complete side note. So when the two cowboys that Virgil helped kill the next day need to be identified, the newspapers state that a Mr. Stillwell identifies those two guys. Now, we don't know if it was Comanche Jack or Frank, and Brad and I are going around and around now trying to figure this out. But one of either Comanche Jack or Frank Stillwell identified loser 1 and loser 2 as who they are. So he was already, one of them, if it was Frank, he was already associating with questionable people. And Stillwell, so he leaves Prescott sometime after a shooting. We're not sure when. Some people say he went to Mojave County. I haven't been able to support that yet. But if he did go to Mojave County, it would explain why Johnny Behan knows him. Because in April of 1881, Johnny Behan ends up appointing him a deputy sheriff in Tombstone. And that would explain why he does that if they both were in Mojave County at the same time and they might have known each other. But we can't prove that yet. So he goes to Mojave County. By November of 79, he's in Pima County, South Pima County, outside of Tombstone, back before it was Cochise County. He's already involved with Pete Spence. Those of you who know Tombstone history know that Pete Spence was another psychotic murderer involved in the Cowboys. So Stillwell and Spence are together. They're in Pima County, and they are arrested for murder. So November of 79, Mr. Houghton was a Tucson resident who had a mine, and it was the Bronco mine, but it was spelt weird, the Broncow mine, outside of Pima County, outside of Tucson. And Mr. Houghton is going to check on his mine. As he's going to check on the mine, the next morning, he's found dead. Somebody took a rock and crushed his skull in and killed him. Now, earlier that day, who was seen around the Bronco mine but Pete Spence and Frank Stillwell? So they get arrested because they were there at the scene prior to the crime, and they end up being released for lack of evidence. They can't prove that it was them that did it, but they're already getting an ill name in South Pima County. So that's as far as it goes for his relationship to Prescott. As we know, he ends up getting appointed by Johnny Behan as a deputy sheriff in April of '81. 4 months later, he is fired for accounting irregularities. I think that's a nice way of saying he stole money, and he's released from his duty as a deputy sheriff. He ends up, him and Pete Spence end up being arrested for a stage robbery out of Benson. He gets off on that because nobody can prove it. That builds up his animosity with Virgil and Morgan and Wyatt. And then on March 18th, the day before Wyatt's birthday, Morgan Earp is shot in the back of the pool hall on Allen Street. And then 2 days later, Holliday, the Earps are taking Morgan's body back to San Bernardino. They're on the train. They get as far as Tucson. Guess who's hanging around the train station in Tucson? But Stillwell. I'm sorry. Yeah, Stillwell. And by the way, Pete Spence's wife later on said that it was Stillwell that killed Morgan. So he ends up being killed by Wyatt and Doc. And they actually, I don't know if you all have seen it before, but the city of Tucson puts up a big bronze statue at the train station to commemorate the murder. You gotta love Arizona. So, Virgil could have known Frank Stillwell. They were both in Prescott. It's a small town. In '77, it was probably only about 500, 600 people there. He might have known him by sight at least. They may have been in court together at the same time. It's hard to say. Stillwell could have known Behan from Mojave County. And Stillwell could have known Thomas Fitch or Dr. Goodfellow, at least by sight. Both of those men were very esteemed professionals. Stillwell was a dirty, low-down cowboy. So they probably didn't hang out together, but he might have known him by sight. They may have known him by sight. It's hard to say. Stillwell is the weak link in all of this, unfortunately. He's so hard to track down. We're still working on that. Brad, come on up here. That ends my aspect of this show. I do want to again plug the Whiskey Row History Show with Cast 11. Brad and I we've done Doc Holliday in Prescott, but we're going to redo it with pictures and video. We've done Virgil in Prescott. We've done 2 Stranger Than Fiction saloon stories, and we have a lot more stories to tell. And Brad, come up here.